for you.
Just a few setups about what these birth control requirements have looked like in the present and in the past before we even begin this kit. Note that, first of all, this looks like things like forced or coerced sterilization to mothers or young women. And note that this policy uniquely affects the most vulnerable women, because women of higher class or have privilege and authority have probably ways to avoid this policy altogether, or they're protected to some degrees by their families who have the power and resources to do so. So the subject of this debate is not women as a blanket in these developing countries. It's women who do not have the power and resources to defend themselves from invasive measures that fundamentally infringe upon their human rights. But second of all, note that this looks like also stripping social welfare benefits from pre-existing large families in order to de-incentivize similar communal constructs. This looks like things like if a family has 3 to 4 children, you're stripping things like social welfare benefits, healthcare benefits, and education benefits, because you do not want other people seeing these large families thrive in order to continuously de-incentivize large family dynamics. But third of all, this also looks like things like social ostracization of like second, third, fourth children, in the sense that, you're someone who actively blocks the developmental aid that our country needs, therefore you are an unneeded presence, right? So a lot of these measures create giant negative external effects that I think OP has the burden to justify. Note here that there's several reasons why the public that are affected by this remain uncooperative, and so it has to be coercive and invasive in nature. A, note that women's rights are extremely low due to traditional authorities within these countries anyway, which means that this policy isn't going to be used as an uplift where they suddenly have access to things like contraception and so on, but they're most likely used as a vehicle or object to avoid poverty or to make this development aid go through. But B, note that it's really hard for people in rural areas or the subaltern to have nuanced understandings of why this developmental aid is so necessary, or second of all, why they have to sacrifice important family members or their livelihoods for this developmental aid. So it's likely that they remain uncooperative to some degree as well, which means the state, or rural communities that the state coerces to do so, has to use things like physical or social force in order to maintain this sort of policy. But third of all, note, and this is important because regret motions pertain to the past of the status quo as well, a lot of these states already have a big number of families that have 3 to 4 kids, which means they're naturally going to try to protect their children from these invasive policies, which means they're likely going to be against, or they're likely going to try to resist these social forces, but they can't, again, because the most vulnerable people are the ones affected within this measure. Also note that due to things like low medical infrastructure or low political infrastructure, it's unlikely that these invasive measures were carried out in a very orderly or safe manner. Likely these women did not have access to things like proper medical care after the operation or anesthesia. They also that these targets were pretty random. It's not like the state has the capability to take a census and only target the women who had 3 to 4 children. Young women from these subalterns who probably could not have the opportunity to start families were probably targeted by this policy. Before that, closing, if you have anything? No, opening?
The fundamental of your case is wrong, because the way these women are coerced is by pursuing them to take more children than they want. It means that the premise of your case is wrong.
I literally have the answer to this case, answer to that POI later. Please wait. Okay. Why then are states so desperate to seek out this sort of force? Or why are states desperate to enforce this policy within the public? A, note that intuitively financial aid as a state is a very, very attractive thing, or a very, very attractive carrot that they're likely to opt into. But B, note that authorities, or the key decision makers that probably have weak democratic checks and balances, want this sort of development aid really, really badly, insofar as they're willing to sacrifice the social utility of the very people that they hold power over. Why is this? Development benefits oligarchs, or the people at the top first, in the sense that they're the ones who have those contracts, or they're the ones who can utilize their own companies or their own resources to benefit off of these projects. But second of all, note that even if the aid takes the form of things like food or medical care, which they can't directly benefit off of, this keeps dissent and resistance to their regime down, which means they have very much selfish incentives to opt into this policy, no matter the cost that comes to the subaltern, right? Why do these organizations not necessarily have the nuance to carry out these policies or monitor this sort of behavior in the past? First, note that things like on-site monitors and infrastructure to track how this policy is being carried was extremely weak in the past, simply because they didn't have enough personnel or technology. But two, note that they simply cared less because overpopulation was seen as a burden, and therefore policy design had to be really intuitive or really flawed in the sense that they're simply going to impose a quota on a statistic or quota on certain populations, which means that these states could use whichever method they wanted to achieve this sort of goal. Principally, why does this harm people? First of all, note that children have an integral importance to traditional rural communities that are the most affected by this policy, in the source that it is a form of self-realization that is most accessible, in the sense that traditionally, these women are delegated to create caretaker roles. You're suddenly depriving them of the role that gives them the importance within the community. But B, note that pre-existing demographics of people, and this is really important, existed out of this policy, existed within the status quo. And these people were continuously harmed by this policy because their presence was seen as an obstacle. Op has to tell you why damaging these people are also justified within the motion. Note that any idea they bring up of how overpopulation is detrimental to development is fundamentally flawed, because overpopulation isn't the freaking reason why developing countries have suffered so long in the past, or why the global poor have suffered so long, right? A, note that it's about asymmetric access to resources that have resulted in exploitative measures and systems such as colonization, right? It's not necessarily because we have too many babies that we are colonized. It's because we did not have the same conditions that powerful countries that are key to these organizations have. But B, note that just things like the lack of democratic norms or legal institutions or market norms that are integral to the development of economy lacked in these areas, and are, even if they prove to you somehow that overpopulation is an important metric, these are far more important metrics these organizations should have utilized in order to make development contingent or more effective. But let's say, even if you don't take anything I've just told you, all the practical metrics, all the principles I've told you, principally this motion is wrong. Because even if we agree that overpopulation is a creed problem, what justification do you have as a white savior sitting in a committee room in some UNHCP program saying that, hey, A, we can strip the traditional roles or modes of self-realization that are integral to these individuals for the sake of development, right? But B, note that it actively compromises the life plans or loved ones of these individuals who do not have access to resources or public capital to resist these measures. I've never been more proud to propose a motion in my life. Thank you so much.
I thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech. I'd like to next invite the Leader of Opposition to open the opposition case.
Please don't try to find the meaning of what they said. Okay, I just two shout outs to the friends and family back in home. If you're watching this, I love you, and also to the entire council contingent, honors and applause. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1, go. The way that they portray that, oh, for centuries we have been oppressing the developing country by using this imposition is entirely wrong, because birth control itself is a modern invention. So if they have to prove that for how long we have been using it, that there was a time when there was no technology to control or monitor it, I'm not entirely sure. But secondly, the white savior complex is ironic, because in their side of the house, they don't oppose developmental aid. The fact that you have to take aid either ways from the developed countries of the world so that you can survive itself is unfair, and they cannot change it as well. So the white savior complex exists in either side of the house. They cannot win the debate on that. They have to win on which side is vulnerable people are better protected, given we are dependent on these West countries. Secondly, first of all, now moving to the basics. Why do I think that this will be done, right? Instead of what they say that this will be coerced and forced. First of all, understand the fact that it is international organizations and NGOs, they require funding to survive. They get funding from philanthropists, they get funding from billionaires, they get funding from states. All this actors make sure that their money is going to the most efficient way, in the most fair way possible. Because this in the NGO market, in the NGO scenario, there are a lot of competitions. If you feel like there is one NGO that is not doing their job right, you have thousands of other options that they can donate to. And that is why this NGO themselves wants to make sure that the money that they're using is properly used, and they report it to the investor to make sure the investor is happy. And while doing so, if the investor ever gets any complaint, or the investor sees that there are women who are being literally forced to have pills or coerced to do everything, I'm pretty sure this investor who cares about social development, which is the reason why they donate to this cause in the very first place, would be very unhappy. That will affect your funding. So I'm not sure why they would do this, and these NGOs would coerce people into doing this at the very first place. Secondly, when the NGO go there, they don't just go there blindly. They do research, they do monitoring, they find out what the issues, what the local culture looks like. How do they do that? They collaborate with local NGOs and find out that in this region, what's culture like, what's the economy like, and stuff like that. What do the women think? And then they try to develop a plan based on that, and try to make sure how to convince them at the very first place. In a lot of cases, we have seen NGOs even using religious texts, religious codes to justify using birth control and say that yes, you can do this, it's completely justified. A lot of the cases even collaborate with local religious leaders to convince the people that we have to do this. So I'm entirely unsure why an NGO whose goal is to increase efficiency would just go into banging doors and force people, while they have better options like collaborating with people that these local individuals cares about, communities cares about, and use them to convince these people to use this at the very first place. Secondly, they don't just go and supply birth control. They train field level workers, they train volunteers, they create community clinics that help create awareness on this. They do media campaigns on national television and other mediums through which they can reach to people and convince them that birth control is something that is necessary and you have to do this. And they have to do this because without that you will just supply birth control, no one will use it, and they know it. And that's why they will actively make sure that there is awareness, there are people who are capable of advising people properly on using this birth control. So I'm unsure why this, like the coercion that they talk about, even happens at the very first place. But lastly, these NGOs have an image to maintain. Like a scandal like that, oh, this NGO is going there and forcing people to take birth control is something that would destroy their image. I'm not sure why an NGO, which consists of people who for their whole life work with women, cares about this vulnerable woman, would want this scandal and also would want to force people at the very first place. So NGOs have the capacity to prevent all the coercion, but secondly, they also have the incentives to prevent all the coercion. I'm not sure what they're aiming at. But secondly, if they come up and then later on come up and claim that, okay, but why do we need to make it conditional on A? If like birth control is so great, it will happen anyways, right? But no, the reason is because of the exact reason that they themselves say, states in their side of the house have very less incentive to take policies that distribute birth control, right? Because understand the fact that because states are, let's say, conservative, or because let's say states are in those states birth control is a rather unpopular idea, the state who is in power is the political party who will stay for 5 years and who just want votes. So they would just want to make conservative people angry. But now you might question, so why does the backlash go in our side? Here's the thing. These individuals, even though they are conservative, but they also like need food in their table and they need healthcare as well. So what happens in our side of the house is that state has an excuse to say to these voters that, see, I know you are angry that I am supporting this, but I have to do this because if I don't take this aid, then you won't have infrastructures. I won't be able to curb inflation. I won't be able to provide you food at the table and reduce the cost of your basic necessities. So what happens is that now people are convinced that yes, the state needs to do this. They are not as angry as it in their side of the house because state can simply use the excuse of universal aid, and everyone loves aid because it makes their life significantly easier. And that is why it happens only our side, but this can use an excuse in their side. The state has no excuse to do this, and that is why state will probably never do this. So all the harms that we talk about are extremely exclusive. Now, secondly, why is it better for the woman, right? I'll take the view after this. Understand the fact that when they come up and say that women are being coerced, it's funny because in most of the states, women are coerced to have sex as well, right? So I'm sorry for trigger warning, I guess. But here's the thing. Understand the fact that there is a power asymmetry that exists within the state between the man and the woman. And when the man in the family goes and demands for physical intercourse, it is very unlikely that the woman will have the agency to say no. And that's exactly why in most of these cases, these families have unwanted children, and lots of them, because the women don't have the agency to say no because they're coerced and brought up in a situation where they have been told that you can never say no to your husband, and that's exactly why this power asymmetry exists. In our side, when we have this more of this birth control, it is likely that the woman cannot say no when having physical intercourse, but at least they will convince the husband that please let us use protection, and that is more likely, and that is why the woman has more agency, because in their side, probably women are stuck with more children, which destroys their career, destroys their physical health, which destroys every hope and ambition that this woman has about their life. I'm not sure why this happens. But secondly, answer the fact that in most of these cases, the people don't even have the knowledge that having more children is bad, right? Which is what happens in our side, because as we already stated, we don't just supply birth control, we also create awareness so that people know why is it important to have less children. In our side, the woman is more likely to resist and say that, see, I have seen it in the television or I have heard it from the local doctor that if I have more children, it is bad for my health. If I have more children, it will be bad for our family planning in future. This awareness is what helps women resist more of the unnecessary, this create more agency for the woman. Now, lastly, why states get better in our side of the house? Simply resource allocation. In our side, when there is unwanted pregnancy and unwanted population growth, it means that state cannot anticipate how many population will be there 10 years down the line, in which regions will have the highest amount of population. And surveys don't really ask like how many times you plan to have sex. So understand the fact that in our side we have more there's the amount of dependent population like pregnant women or children who are unproductive to the economy increases. So it becomes significantly harder for the state to allocate resources. In our side, the pregnancies are more planned, population growth is more planned. State knows that in which area I need to allocate which amount of resources. And also lastly, simple. The amount of money that they use for 10 people, we use it for 2 people. That is inherently better. Proud to propose.
I thank the Leader of Opposition for that fine speech. I'd like to next invite the Deputy Prime Minister to defend the government case.
Oh, okay. Though this cringe, I still want to do a quick couple of shout outs to people who really deserve it. First, it's to my mom, have been supporting my debating career since day zero, even though I was really bad in the beginning. I'm really thankful for all the support she has given until now. But then secondly, also my amazing debate partner, my institution, Waseda University, and other Japanese debaters that I've met along the way. I'm really thankful because of the really supportive community that they've been given to me until now. And lastly, Dennis, thank you for always being there for me. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. First, I'm going to explain to you the counterfactual. Why then, when this birth control requirement is not actually going to be imposed, it's still going to be better anyway, because notice that development is organically going to lead to the suppress of birth rate anyway. Insofar, opening opposition never necessarily tell you how bad about this overpopulation is going to be, and how that is necessarily have to be solved in this kind of like imposition under the subject house. We're going to give you the context, right? Why this is organically going to happen. First, notice the context that we are debating right now is talking about like a developing country or an underdeveloped country that haven't necessarily been going to this kind of like process of an increase of like a development technology. Now this kind of like suppression of birth rate naturally come as this kind of things like increase. I'm going to explain one by one. First, in terms of like increase in technology, implication here, it means that when as development progress, there's more likely going to be, for example, better infrastructure to actually support this kind of like treatment, like for a contraception, for this kind of sterilization. But then secondly, it's also simply like better infrastructure for like better healthcare, better education. That's simply likely going to trickle down, which move on to the second point, which is like simply increase in education is also likely going to counterpart like this kind of like traditional beliefs or like this kind of like superstition beliefs, right? Insofar, even opening opposition can see that the idea that this kind of women are actually coerced into like believing that like, we have to have like a lot of child because that's what we're supposed to do. Increase in education levels simply are going to wash out this kind of like traditional beliefs slowly in an organic way. Insofar, they know that like traditional beliefs does not necessarily have a lot of like logical or real practical benefits. We say in the long term, it's likely to increase in education. These kind of like beliefs slowly are going to get better. This also looks like, for example, more women getting educated, which means we see like more feminist movement or like more people, women specifically, actually speaking up for their rights, and therefore likely to create like at least a marginal change that's likely going to happen organically. But then lastly, it's also a shift in how society works. works, right? Insofar, this kind of like developing country or underdeveloped country are in the initial likely going to be very close up to a certain extent. Insofar, like this kind of like development are likely going to lead, for example, like a larger market share with the other neighboring countries, or for example, like a certain extent of like globalization. We say it's very likely that therefore a liberal beliefs coming from outside or general this society change that we see as a trend in common like normal underdeveloped country and developing country. For example, like less trend of like increase overpopulation is also likely going to happen under our side of the house. Then this very quick and strict imposition is not necessarily accompanied with quick enough development that actually necessarily going to catch up about this like sudden trend, right? The counterfactual that's likely going to happen under their side of the house regarding about most inorganic attempt of like trying to suppress this kind of like a bird population often have result to a lot of like bad aftermath. We see like a huge human rights violation, and especially when opening opposition already can see that anyway, this kind of like government of like developing countries oftentimes are actually really oppressive, actually really authoritarian to a certain extent. I don't think they ever explain to you why then simply by giving a contraception or like birth control are going to lead to actual societal change, right? We say what's most likely going to happen is that this very oppressive government are actually going to impose it in a really human rights violation way. For example, they're going to force it to like a certain specific groups and so on. Insofar, opposition already concede that power asymmetry actually do exist. That's really difficult, especially for people at the bottom and like marginalized community, such as women, to actually fight back to this Catholic community. We say it's very likely that under their side of the house, if this kind of like strict imposition is going to happen, then that's the likely aftermath that's going to happen. Before that, closing.
How it is also are being guaranteed on your side. I'm not quite sure about your opinion.
Like examples, okay, again, this is like this house regret motion, right? Notice that like we're talking about like the counterfactual here. Why then the counterfactual is simply going to be better? Insofar, there is no of this kind of like imposition going to happen. I literally already given to you 3 minutes mechanization why then this kind of like more organic change about like women getting educated and actually make a change likely going to happen, right? But then secondly, notice when you inorganically doing that and the development does not necessarily going to catch up, it means it's likely going to happen like, for example, like countries like China that simply have a really, really fast aging population that ended up taking a downturn. Insofar, this kind of infrastructure or the stable livelihood is not necessarily guaranteed under their side of the house. They don't necessarily prove why then it's likely that people actually have the motivation to actually settle down and live for a long life. And not only that they oppressed, we say it's likely that the aftermath is going to lead to like a more of an aging population or underpopulation issue. But then an engagement here. OO says that like funding is really important. Insofar we regret this kind of like imposition is going to be bad. First, I think the general case that's coming to OG and to you is that it's better that this funding simply does not necessarily come with this kind of like strict imposition to begin with. But secondly, if you don't buy this kind of like alternatives, other alternatives simply do exist, right? The only existing fund is not necessarily those that have this kind of like birth control requirement. There exists also other funding, for example, funding that's given for like democracy principles. For example, for developing country or like underdeveloped country to opt into like more of a democracy format or to increase like this kind of like humanitarian rights, right? Insofar, this kind of like alternatives do exist, and we tell you it's going to be better. As the context that we bring here right now, these countries are often authoritarian to a certain extent or really oppressive, opting onto this kind of like funding that's based on this kind of like democratic or like principle values is more likely going to benefit to the people. What then is the comparison here, right? I think firstly, just to like point out the burden, opposition still have to prove anyway why then exclusively this overpopulation only can be solved by restricting this kind of imposition. But then secondly, why then this overpopulation is so bad and there is no solution that's going to happen on our side. Insofar, I think firstly, Lee has told you that for this kind of like country, overpopulation or like having a huge population is not necessarily bad, as we see like developing countries and underdeveloped countries ended up using this as their power to actually climb to the economical market and so on. But then secondly, we also told you that there is this kind of like organic mechanism that's likely going to happen even if you don't impose this kind of like strict regulation and so on. But then what we have given to you the contribution to OG, right? First, we have given to you the practical benefits onto why the counterfactual are simply much better into this kind of like development and make sure that this kind of like minority is actually better. But even if this is not enough, I think we have already explained to you the principal justification insofar this is our our regulation is going to impose so much human rights violation. We are very proud to regret this. Proud to be OG.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech. Before I invite the DLO, just a reminder for teams to offer POIs with your microphone so that we can hear you clearly and the audience can hear you clearly as well. I'd like to next invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to conclude the opening half.
Hello. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. How do you help women? First, you need to understand why women are vulnerable in these countries. The reason women are vulnerable is that oftentimes they're coerced to take children. Motherhood is defined as their own part of their characteristics, and they say that you can be a good person only if you become a good mother. They say that, eventually they have literally no say in terms of how many kids they want to take. So what happens is that oftentimes they have to give up on their career, they have to give up on their education, and oftentimes they have to take early pregnancies, in which it creates out a problem. How does it change in our side of the house, which never happens in proposition bench? The first, we allow women to have a better say in how many kids they want to say. The reason it happens in our side of the house is that in our side of the house, there is more influence from the West, there is more influence from the NGOs, in which they say that why taking too many kids are problematic for you, why you cannot take so many kids, and how this is actually something that you should not do. It means that if women want to have less amount of kids, one, they can have better say in terms of they want to have less amount of kids, but two, in terms of they are less pressurized to take kids in itself. It means that if this woman wants to have more liberty, it is much more possible in our side of the house. But secondly, in our side of the house, there's significantly more control over their fertility, right? It means that in our side of the house, you have, probably, if you don't want to finish up your career, if you want to complete other things, you can probably opt into those things which are oftentimes cut down in their side of the house, because this woman have to spend years after years to being as a pregnant woman, and eventually they cannot actually just look over anything else other than bear their own things, right? In our side of the house, the more important thing that we do is that we do a cultural shift. In their side of the house, the culture says that to bring and produce children. In our side of the house, we say that how you can get away from this, and oftentimes, even if you have less amount of kids, it is fine. It is okay to have minimum amount of kids. It means that in our side of the house, we actually reduce the number of problems that happens, but it has a direct impact. Because in our side of the house, when there's less amount of women who are pregnant, it means that now you have less maternal pressure in the hospitals. It means that the maternal death or other things becomes low. But also when you promote things like condoms and other things, you reduce things like STD, which is really common in those countries, right? It means it's really important to get all of these things. The way in this argument is pretty simple. The first thing we say is that in our world, probably they're coerced as well. In their world, they're coerced as well. But this is on the scale. In their world, these women are coerced to take 4 kids, while in our world, these women are probably coerced to take 1 or 2 kids, which is significantly number. It is better in scale. Secondly, I agree with Oshi that oftentimes they don't have access to anesthesia and other things. But the only way that this can get better is in our side, because we have better access to this developmental aid. But also secondly, we have less amount of women who are pregnant. But the third way here is pretty simple, is that it is about agency. I don't think that these women have really that much of agency in their side of the house as well, because there is a power asymmetry of agency that exists in either side of the house. But why this get better in our side of the house is that in our side of the house, you can just have more amount of liberty just for the mechanization that I gave you. But the last thing, I'm just unsure. What is if person comes up and say some women want to take 10 kids and they are forced to take 2? What about that? We are willing to take the trade-off, because one, it is better for the woman in herself, but also this is better for the kids in herself. It means in our side of the house, we increase the liberty of the woman, but also we ensure that the direct risk that has for this woman is reduced to a certain extent. That's why we win on the clash point of women. Let's win on the clash point of how it's good for their country or how it's good for the economy in itself. I think this argument has 3 implications. The first one, I'm going to flip the opening government argument in terms of what's good for kids. I will say that what's good for kids in our side of the house. But second thing that I will do is that in order to maintain your population, in order to maintain your economy, it is important that you have a significant control over the population that you have. Because you have too many people, you cannot control your policies to a certain extent. But third, in order to make your policies better, in order to make your aid efficient, it is really important that you have a certain amount of population that you can control. That's when our role is going to be efficient. What is going to be far better in our side of the house? The first, the number like per individual resource is going to be significantly higher than in their side of the house. Because one in their side of the house, even if at the very best case they get this development aid without any condition, the problem is that those aids are available for so many people because now you have no control over the population in itself. Because the thing they say is that, oh, probably we are going to change them in the longer run, they are going to opt into it. But problem is that by their own mechanization, this country is conservative, this country is problem is unlikely they are going to change all the cultures to actually become and take less amount of kid. But two, even if they take, it is so significantly less in scale than opening opposition, right? In our side of the house, we can control it far better. The reason is important is that when in a family, you have now 2 persons to feed instead of 5 persons to feed. It means that now you can give them better access to education, you can give them better access to healthcare, you can give them better access to nutrition. The reason it's important is that often in those countries, children or kids die out of nutrition. These children cannot complete their education in itself. In our side of the house, we try to change it and we make sure these kids get better resources than opening government can ever achieve. Before I move on to closing, if you have any? No, opening?
Patriarchal systems will still dominate resources due to archaic systems. How do you solve this through an externally imposed policy in one fell swoop?
We give something to solve the problem. I'm unsure what they're giving to actually solve patriarchy in their side of the house. The delta is completely unclear from opening government. Okay, move on. Second thing that I would like to say is that in our side of the house, there's better manageable population that you have. The way it works is that in our side of the house, now you have a better probability to ensure. Okay, so in our side of the house, we have better probability to have a better, more active workforce. The way it works is that in our side of the house, there are less vulnerable or less active, less active workforce are available. So the way it works is that when there are more like the people who are not active workforce are probably the people who are kids or the woman or the like the pregnant woman or the like other people. In this side of the house, when this is significantly high on the scale, they have less active workforce that is available, which is much more probable in our side in which we have a much more active workforce. But more importantly, in our side of the house, when you have less amount of population, it means that you can actually amplify your healthcare system, you can welfare system much more better because you have less amount of individuals to care about in which you can actually allocate resources and you can make sure policies are better. So the reason it is important is that in order to make sure the aid that you are giving, the aid that you are actually applying in this country to be effective, to be actually working out, you have to ensure that the people is in control because this is the prerequisite, this is the precondition to ensure that your country is working. You can give so many money, but if the policies are not working in favor of you, it is not going to work out for you. In our side of the house, we not only give the aid, but also make sure the way that it works. In our side of the house, the first thing that we do is that in our when they have lack of control, this action just goes beyond and eventually it creates further problem. In our side of the house, we control it. The implication and the conclusion of this argument is pretty simple. In our side, we help kids to get better access to things, but also more importantly, we have better access to resources. There is probably no problem if the world has 20 billion people now, but the reason it's problematic is because you are probably not going to get food in the next chapter.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that fine speech. To begin the closing half, I call upon the Member of Government.
Before starting, I started for my own community at university and also Kansai community and Russia or Minami or many and also I want to shout out for Yuichiro, my partner, because he's my initial master's and he gives me opportunity to start debating in university and also I must debate for him. And what I can do is that I make him champion this round. So I think this. So then, three arguments from member of government. Firstly, we say simply this policy likely to cause a decline of aid, or more importantly, we believe those developing countries likely to receive the money from the more shadow places, things like China, and more unethical places. Secondarily, we also prove even if some country receives some country accept birth control requirement, it is horrible because it links to the no social status children, and who have no job status, who have no banking access, and so on. And lastly, we believe this is principally unjust. First argument, we believe there is some context of the country. Some country might accept this policy, but some countries do not accept this policy. Because these alternative exist, China or many other countries, which is exist on the shadow places, which gives them money without conditions, such explicit harmful conditions. In such cases, firstly, this is very reasons. Firstly, all say NGO do not coerce, it's not coercive. This is true. However, this is the reasons why such a developing country is easily to reject such a money from the West, from the NGO and so on. Secondarily, also all say religious leader likely to justify and convince the people because infrastructure is important. However, problem is about the infrastructure, there is an alternative exists, and it is a more easier way for the Western religious leader to convince the people because you can implement the infrastructure or get the subsidy from China without such a conditional birth requirement. So you are likely to take this policy on one side of the house. Then on the other side of the house. Then why is this harmful? Because firstly, simply this country in the worst case do not receive the money from the Western countries. Simply the total amount of the aid is marginal. This is horrible because there is no food or temple. But secondarily, more importantly, you are likely to lend the money from such a China or a shadow country. And why is this bad? Because firstly, China deprives your country's long-term benefit, right? Which means things like shipping was port was many other things, and also importantly, things like China likely to force you to implement the yuan as a reserve currency or something like that. Not religious leaders likely to accept this condition because this condition is more implicit and likely to be invisible. So compared to such a birth control policies is more unnatural for you. You are likely to accept those looks at unconditional policy, and individually in the long term, you lose the money. You are exploited by the China. Secondarily, also ethical Western companies, things like MNCs, likely to leave from this country because they have a conflict with China. They care about the US politicians' reputations and so on. In such cases, those countries go to the other countries which also have a very cheap labor. So eventually, this leads to the lack of the economy. Western MNCs less likely to come to your country. That is horrible. Lastly, exploitative MNCs likely to kick in things like Chinese versions and so on, and those companies is more untransparent because there is no ESG investment as opposed to the Western countries. On our side, we are likely to have a more healthy ethical cooperation with us with the house. That is to say, Western companies, which is scrutinized by the ESG investment and the Western reputations and so on. For those reasons, we flip the equal cases. Our side have more money. Our side have more better MNCs. So our side is better. Then second question, but before that, yes.
I read the motion again for you. The motion says you said IPPF and other funds. I never says China. That's not sure that why you case is based upon.
This motion does not suggest all the money must implement these conditions. There's definitely other agencies. Then second extension. Some country receives and accepts the birth control requirement. But this is really horrible. Because what happens? What happens is that country starts to hide the number of children in order to receive the money. They statistically deceive the Western countries. This is very horrible because there are children who have no social admission by the government, who have no social status by the government. Why is this horrible? Why is this case? Because firstly, government have no capacity to control the birth of the children, birth of the living in the first place. Because contraception or many other treatment is actually so expensive, politicians have an incentive to use such a money for the other policy. Secondarily, family is in the rural areas, likely to hide the children from the local government. So which means they are likely to, insofar as culture still exists as Oji pointed out, I think those things likely to happen. And lastly, there's a lack of the literacy in this. So even if some religious leader can convince, I think still there's some people who cannot understand the importance. Then, what is the impact? I said all this impact is very lazy. They just talk about social welfare. We believe more severe impact likely to kick in. Firstly, there is no social status, which means you literally have no access to the job, especially about the ethical jobs, things like MNCs or many other things. You have no access to the job in the first place. Also, you have no access to the hospital because you have no social status. And also, more importantly, you have no mobile bank. You have no bank account because you have no social status. In such cases, you can't raise the money from such a bank in order to launch your own small economy, in order to purchase a car, which is car, and bicycles, which is prerequisite to do any economical simple jobs and so on. In such cases, those children become really this is really work on the really exploited companies or simply have no job. That is really horrible situations. Secondarily, you're likely to isolated by the family and the community in the worst case. Family likely to give a birth to you because it's simply might be expect you become a labor forces. However, unfortunately, if you become adults, you have no longer have no job access. I already explained. In such cases, you have no social status as you are a member of family. Family likely to hide you. Family likely to isolate you. Family likely to kick up to you in such cases. This is physically and psychologically harmful. You have no any guarantee, even from the family. That is very horrible. So for those reasons, that is practically that is horrible. But lastly, I want to talk about the principle. We believe we have no right to deprive human choice in the first place. They have a right to live. Children can get some utility on outside, things like eating food with family, things like prayer for the church or the God and so on. Those benefits still exist, and insofar as utility exists on the back end, and we have no epistemic access to which is actually right and so on. We have no rights to deprive individuals of the choice in the first place. But secondarily, most importantly, especially in these motions, Western countries have no legitimacy to implement this policy because the reason why overpopulation happened is because Western countries, they succeeded to make the things like methods to preserve the food in the long term, or making the medical treatment and so on. Those development of the technology actually cause and escalate overpopulation, which means Western country is actually obligated to this overpopulated situation. This should unconditionally give the money for those developing countries. Condition is actually so push obligation to developing countries. This is very horrible. For those reasons.
I think the member of government proposed, but we understood the speech anyway. I thank the member of government for that fine speech. I'd like to next invite the member of opposition to open the case for the closing opposition.
I just want to say thank you to everything and like Sia-san in the beginning and start my speech quickly. My time begins in 3, 2, 1, start. 100 years ago in Japanese society, children under 18 did not have names. They're not being seen as human in society. Why? This is because 4 out of 5 children anyway die, and that has been seen as natural in society. Closing opposition opposes any form of instrumentalization of children's life for the sake of community development, any form of reproductive rights of women, if that kills more number of children in the end. There exists a strong necessity of external intervention, and this is what closing opposition claims in this debate. 3 things in my speech. Firstly is about value of life, value of children, how they are being seen in society on 2 houses. Secondly, how an opposition, a nuclear family model is likely to be introduced and why this makes people far more happy. Thirdly is about value judgment and weightings. Firstly, let's see how society consists and how they perceive children's life on 2 sides of the house. What government would definitely introduce is a model called Showa model that used to exist in Japan and lots of developing states, where 10 children are being born by 1 children and 8 are going to be died in their childhood. There are 2 features. Firstly, the whole communities assume this existence of model. They don't provide enough amount of medical care to each children. They have no funerals, child rearing are being something risky by nature. But secondly, families arbitrarily compare children and prioritize and compare them directly. For example, they're likely to concentrate resources on the best growing child. They provide most amount of food resources, and they leave behind other children who are not growing enough. And they are forced to do housework. They're forced to care about their food resources, and they're anyway going to die in early ages. Why does this happen? Firstly, this is important because this model has come from traditional cost-benefit calculations where children anyway had to die in early stages, and communities believe this model is optimal. Especially this comes from religious or traditional values, and traditional people, old people, powerful in communities believe this is the best way, and they pressurize children, they pressurize family to give birth as many children as possible. But secondly, it's coming from lack of contraception. This was out of their control. There was a game theoretic move to the equilibrium of Showa models, and it was unavoidable in lots of developing contexts, just like in Japan. But secondly, because obviously resources are lacking, it's impossible for society to maintain every children's life until they grow until 20. The amount of aid that's probably is symmetrical on their house per person is much less on their side. Governmental budget, food production is much less per person. Therefore, necessarily, many amount of children have to die in their early stages of their life. And it's impossible for government side to adopt a model to care about every single child for born in society. Even if we take the best case scenario of closing government, we don't believe whole societies are also assuming this Showa model. Therefore, the whole government concedes to provide less care into children, and they have to admit that conclusions. What's happening on our side, which is our second argument? Probably a nuclear family model, which gives birth to less number of children, would be adopted as the optimal calculation in most contexts. This happens for two ways. Firstly, it comes from active contraceptions, unwanted pregnancy decreases. But secondly, it comes from direct restriction in the amount of welfare or tax exemption by government. If giving birth to a lot of children come from utilitarian calculation of whole communities, we think government prioritizing family having less children. If government prioritize giving them more tax exemption to family with less children, it's so natural for the whole community, whole family to shift their decision making, just like what has been happening in China in the first place. Only way to shift decision making, community level decision making, is governmental and external interventions, and this is a tipping point where an incentive to avoid overpopulation happens. On our side of the house, there are less children. You have to concentrate your resource on one children. You have to be sure to raise your child until they become 20. This leads to more parental obligation, shift to the moral code that your life is important. You spend more amount of resources into your own children. Why is this model far more important than their side model? We have 4 value judgment metric. What's important? No team in this debate provides any meta value judgment metric, and we think ours should be the largest priority. 4 points. Generally, life's value in society is perceived to be much less than their side of the house. People are literally dying every day due to hunger. Enough amount of commiserations, funerals are not done, and you are likely to underevaluate the life value of yourself. You feel like your life is controlled by luck or God, and this decreases your self-esteem. The moral code based on the self identity, like rejecting the self-religions, are more likely to spread uniquely on their side of the house. But secondly, as the children who are randomly born into these societies, you feel less to be cared by your families, mothers, by communities. You're likely to receive less amount of loves, protections. You're oftentimes directly compared with your siblings. You're oftentimes be sacrificed your life for labors. You're structurally made to be unhappy, and that's invaluable. Thirdly, ethical metric of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, we believe utility of non-existence is far larger than utility of children who are not neutralized enough, who are not cared, and who are dead in the end in the early stage of life. If they're not born, they don't feel unhappiness in the first place. And given that this society consists of large amount of unhappiness of children, we think it's much more utile for these children not to be born in the first place. The last is the ontological metric. Children has been instrumentalized in developing context. You never consented to die in age. You never consented to be born only as a laborer and be compared as a one option of your families. Society intentionally and artificially gave birth to you to be sacrificed in society, and we think this should be denied from the deontological metrics. Before that, OG.
Activates when child protective policies and norms are suddenly massively uplifted due to this external policy, which is not the case.
Okay, we're not talking about such radical issues because on either side of the house, probably minimum amount of food resources do in fact exist. This is the precondition for communities and nations to exist. And if the number of children decreases from 10 to 2, it's obviously mean the amount of resource concentration is likely to happen uniquely on the other side. We don't think this burden is so high. This happens regardless of amount of economical development or like economy issues. 2 layers of weighing. First, we believe this is superior to women autonomy argument, which is the main issue in opening half in 3 ways. First, this is because we can prove that governmental case where women are forced to give birth to baby, where women are limited to give birth to baby, are anyway symmetrical. Like people are made controlled in society, especially when they're like conservative in development, and women are also being instrumentalized to give birth to as many children as possible, whereas the likely counterfactor which holding opposition uniquely proven in this debate. But secondly, children are the actors who have less control in this debate. They cannot choose to be born. They're really vulnerable because they have no voice in the first place. But thirdly, within children argument are much larger in number, larger in extent. They have no political voice. They're much larger in number, much larger than the number of women. This is a life or death issues because taking away people's options, taking away people's to live happily within their life, the prerequisite of this argument is to grow until you become 20 in the first place. And lots of people are being robbed of this access. Nextly, weighing toward economical development in 2 ways. Firstly, governments never prove why social development leads to subjective happiness. Correlation is so unclear. So many people in US feel unhappy strictly because of capitalism that strictly make you feel unsatisfied. But secondly, access to jobs, benefit of development, all comes from the assumption that you are able to become a member of this community and be admitted as being valuable in society. Oppose.
I thank the member of opposition for that fine speech. To summarize the government bench, I call upon the government whip.
Okay. Just shout out to my partner Masmitsu. I think he's very hardworking guy, and I'm very lazy. So because of his contribution, I'm now standing here, and I'm very proud to be standing here with him. Thank you. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's take out seal. All clear case is based on the compliance to this policy, but my extension is about people would never comply to this policy. Why? What has happened in the one-child policy in China? Many of the people just hide their existence of the children. They have no name, they have no address, they have no birthday. These children have spread all around China. This is what happens in your side of the house. Why? 3 structural reasons. Firstly, technology such as surgery or the medicine for fertilization is less available because it's expensive for the most of the people, especially in the real conditions. But secondly, that people have no literacy or less understanding towards the policy which is taken by the central government. But thirdly, in the local regions, the tribe power and the community leaders have much more power to say in the to what to do in the family, what to do in the community level. That is why even if central government wants you to follow this policy, the tribe have still incentive to continue expansion of your tribe, continue expansion of the family. That's why on the hidden level, more people just exist in the outside house without the status. If they want the worst case of the worst life of the children, and they get worse in the inside house. But secondly, do not get deluded by the rhetoric. Their policy just discard 8 or 9 amount of the people out of the tents in their side house. They said utility, but I think utility is never accessible for the people, and it's accumulation of the life. Yes, maybe they will lie because of malaria, but they have accumulation of the experiences of playing with the soccer with another children, having same meat with their child, sleeping their own mother and father. These experiences accumulate, and we cannot know how the utility goes, beneficial or just disadvantageous. more important thing is these children, 9 or 8 out of the 10, have deprived even the rights to access the agency and to live in the society, which means they have no and the reason why we should care about the children is because the children have no agency because of they have no consent to be born. If it is true, you have to deprive 9 or 8 amount of the children's consent and the deprivation of the rights and agency in their side of the house. Last thing to say is objectification and the instrumentalization of the children. If the pressure is concentrated on the 1 children or 2 children, that pressurization by the society and community much larger scale in their side of the house. And I think that's bad for the children. Moving on to opening opposition. What they said mainly 2 things, development and the woman's care. Firstly, about the development. The entire mechanism is dependent on the 2 premises. Firstly, less population and concentration of the welfare resources. Secondly, more aid. Our case completely denies their case. Why? Because even if we take this policy, just people denies the existence of the children, which means no less population and no concentration of the resources into the specific people, because people is there and people is massive still on the scale. But secondly, also we have explained that the mechanism of the development is only dependent on the aid, but we have explained the massive countries because just decline this aid because of this dry power, because it is very visceral for the people to cut off your dick or these kind of things. And the last thing to say is, I think the amount advantage of the people in the developing countries to develop their own economy is their population and the accumulation of the massive amount of the population. Because they are less skilled workers, and the only advantage is this. And if they are deprived of this advantage, what types of MNC would come? What types of foreign investment would come to the developing country? And I think this industrial level of mechanism is maybe more important compared to their analysis about the aid. Why? Because the aid is short-term and limited amount of the time, but I think this industrial the benefit because of the large population of existing in the developing country is long-term more, I think. Before moving on to the women's point, I'll take a point.
You can poke a lot of hole in our case why it won't work, but you have no solution to women dying in pregnancy or suffering from STD. This is the impact single-handedly should opening opposition make us quit the debate.
I think your mechanism is based on somehow aid, and I go to, if you talk about women, I go to regards to that from now on. Their side's problem about the protection of the women from the objectification and the instrumentalization is we get out of them from the role of the giving birth to 3 or 4 children. What they have missed is there are no structural changes as reach the mechanism in their side of the house, why the woman suddenly gets the massive amount of light and structurally the people would not perceive human in instrumentalized version. What happens in their side of the house? The value of the woman is now guaranteed by the role to give a birth to the children, to continue the tribe, to continue the family. If this role is expunged or excluded in their side of the house, and women never get give a birth to the children, then the status of the women would get worse in their side of the house, or at least on our side of the house. Even if you get the birth to 1 children, you can expect next children or 4 children or 3 children, which means the community support or the family support exists on the women because they want to continue and expand their own community. This support will never be available in their side of the house if they get 1 children and just fertilized by this surgery or these kind of things. Moving on to the opening government, what they said there's a welfare care system for people existing in status quo and which will be cut off, and that's part. Why this is comparatively worse analysis compared to our hiding the existence of the children. We have explained because you have no social status, because you have no admission by the government as an existence in a human, you have no access in many cases to the jobs, you have no access to the hospitals, because in many cases they require the status and the record of you yourself. Which means why this is more important analysis compared to the welfare cuts coming from the opening government is because in these developing countries, especially needs the aids for the international community, have in the first place less amount of the access to these healthcare system or welfare care system. That is why community support or family support or having the jobs, going to the hospital is a more proximate mechanism for these people to rise up their social ladders. But secondly, also their case about the welfare care support is based on the the existence of the aid, and we have denied that in many cases the people will decline just to accept for this policy in the first place. And the last thing they talk about is women get to be protected. There's very nice POI coming from the closing opposition. The biggest burden on the opening government is to show how women is protected in the counterfactual. We have explained, if you continue to give a birth to 3 of the 4 children and the community have expectation, community have incentive to concentrate the resources on you to continue your expansion of the community in the family. For all these reasons, we win. Thank you.
I thank the government whip for that fine speech. To summarize the opposition bench case, I call upon the opposition whip.
Today my voice is seriously dead, so yeah, I'm gonna talk in a low tone. I hope you guys are able to hear me. Sorry. I'm gonna first talk about closing comment and why it should not be a central issue in this summit. First of all, they talked about the monetary usage and they say that China will come in. I'm not quite sure why it's a bad thing, right? Because on their side of the house, probably that the restriction might exist. Probably on our side of the house, that kind of restriction does exist, and it might be redistributed to country A and B and C. On their side of the house, probably there's no restriction, and therefore it's going to go to the country A and B and C and E and D and E, right? I'm not quite sure why the amount of money is going to be so different in the first place, and China comes in on our side, probably the amount of money will increase, and I'm not quite sure why it's a bad thing in the first place, right? This is that China will sacrifice a long-term benefit. Why it's a bad thing to prioritize short-term benefit? Because these people don't have a job. If Chinese companies come in, probably people are able to have jobs and have access to benefit. I'm not quite sure why all of those things are bad thing in the first place. This is that China is going to utilize yuan. Why it's bad to utilize yuan? Because obviously, USD is incredibly high, right? Transaction cost is really high. Why it's really bad to use yuan on our side of the house, right? So even if their mechanism is correct and China will come in on our side, I'm not quite sure value judgment from closing comment in the first place. They also say that MNSA will leave China. I don't think so, because China will invest more on our side of the house, and probably it's going to be more for profitable, MNSAs, right? We don't talk about US MNSAs. There are so many fucking countries, and we see that those kind of countries are still charitable and have a good cooperation with China, and therefore their first extension force. Secondly, this is that people without people's legal status will not be recognized on our side of the house. Obviously, this is a direct knife to opening comment. I'm not quite sure what is a nuance from closing comment in the first place, but I want to add 2 analysis here. First of all, I don't think the government big rebuttal to our case is no actual rebuttal, right? Because on their side of the house, the value of children are going to be sacrificed, regardless of the legal status, right? So even if you talk in the context in the agricultural area in China, we see that the value of life in itself is going to be decreased on their side of the house, right? This is the nuance of our argument, for they misunderstand our case. Secondly, I don't think the legal status is quite important, especially in developing countries. Number one, in developing countries, they don't have good infrastructure. Anyways, they don't have the access to education. Anyways, they don't have a good hospital, especially in rural areas. I'm not quite sure why legal status is going to magically solve everything on their side of the house in the first place. But secondly, our argument is logically prior to their side of the house, because let's say that you do have the access to schools. Let's say that you do have the access to hospital if they have on their side of the house. Problem here is that if parents don't believe that the children's lives are not really important, parents don't send their children to hospital on their side of the house, right? This is our argument. Children are going to be sacrificed. Children are devalued. Life in itself is going to be sacrificed on their side of the house. Principle from closing comments, not proven, but the thing here is that on their side of the house, children are not given, name are not given to children there will be no funeral for children because there are so many children who die at the age of 5. There's no affection by parents, and therefore they need to live under the suffering. We say that it is better not to live in the first place if children need to live in the hell on their side of the house. Having said that, I want to move on to the way. I guess there are mainly two things in the debate. The first is about women's autonomy, and the second is about economic development. First of all, though it's a crucial issue about the female autonomy, I don't think you should weigh female autonomy over children's life or death problem. The first thing I want to do is a direct rebuttal to the opening comment, because opening comment says that obviously they live in the utopia. They say that there's organic change for female, especially in developing nation. I'm not quite sure it's likely to happen. Their mechanism that's false because they say that they have the access to education. There's a female, feminist movement, but I'm not quite sure why it's really happening, especially in developing nation. Number one, there's a religiosity, which means that the religious values are inculcated to people, especially in developing nation. And as framed by closing comment, people respect, for example, religious leaders on their side of the house. Secondly, women, especially in developing nations, don't have the access to education. And in that situation, I'm not quite sure how the liberation and the organic change are going to be achieved on their side of the house. Thirdly, obviously, feminist movement are incredibly weak in developing nations, right? There are so many issues which they need to prioritize, right? I'm not quite sure how it's going to change on their side of the house. This is at best assertion from opening government, and therefore opening government is at best uncomfortable. Let's say that coercion is likely to happen on our side, but we see that the different kind of coercion is likely to exist in the government side as well. Secondly, let's talk about the coercion. Whether the policy will be implemented in a coercive manner or not. From the closing opposition, I want to say, I don't know, because there are so many exogenous factors. Regimes have different incentives because we are talking about more than 100 countries, right? Culture is so different, religiosity is so different, right? The thing here is that opening opposition is reliant on the opposition's best case scenario, because opening opposition just says that women are able to choose on our side of the house. If the analysis coming from opening government is correct, probably to some extent it's going to be coercive manner on our side of the house. The thing here is that closing opposition is not reliant on this premise, right? Even if it's done in a coercive way, which is that it is okay to save the autonomy of children. It is okay, and it's really fine to sacrifice the autonomy in the first place. Here's a way why children's autonomy should be way over female autonomy. Number one, simply large in number, right? Because we see that 9 out of 10 children are going to die in the developing nation, and those children are going to be sacrificed. Your fathers don't care about you. They don't, pay attention to you. For example, they don't put food on table. They don't let children to go to, medication, etc., etc. This is principal value, right? Because you don't know, and you cannot know, right? And here's the reason why we simply say that not to live in the first place is better than live under the hell on your side of the house.
If traditional and religious values are still going to exist anyway, not only the woman that couldn't give birth to son, but the 2 daughters, that's the maximum capacity, is always going to be discriminated and also stripped of their rights under your side of the house.
I'm going to talk about in the second way, right? Secondly, in terms of the gravity impact with female rights, right? This is that children don't have any meaning on their side of the house. And at the age of 5, without any affection by your father, you are going to die in the coming side. This is principally bad, but at the same time, obviously, practically, children have cognition, children have emotion, children feel that they are being sacrificed and not be respected and not be treated as human beings in the first place. Lastly, in terms of economy, first of all, I'm not quite sure the link with your opening opposition, because opening opposition says that economic development is going to lead to happiness of individual. I'm not quite sure why. People suffer due to capitalism, disparity derives from the economy, and opening opposition and closing government had no value judgment of this, right? They flood the argument. It is fancy, but they actually don't impact the argument in the first place. Closing opposition shows a direct link to the impact, right? Because we are talking about people's cognition. We are talking about how people treat other individuals. And we say that the life which we have is much richer than their side of the house, right? And therefore, we say that the life and how children are going to be autonomy, and how children are going to be treated should be the most important metric in this debate. And therefore, so happy to oppose this motion.
I thank the opposition whip for that fine speech and everyone for an excellent EFL Grand Final. Can we get a round of applause for the teams? I now invite the teams to descend the stage as the panel retires to deliberate the verdict. Teams, you're welcome to retrieve your phones from the table in front.
Hello everyone, it's going to be lunchtime. For open final teams and judges, please be back by 1:45. We'll be doing allocations of whatever. It's 1:45 for the teams and judges.
Shout out to all Bangladeshi people. Yeah.